So now let's talk about ride capacity, otherwise known as THRC. THRC is a great $50 term used in the themed entertainment industry. It stands for Theoretical Hourly Ride Capacity. Now, it's important to talk about what it's not. Theoretical hourly ride capacity is not the number of seats in an attraction show building. And it's also not the number of people physically sitting on an attraction at a moment in time. By the way, Disney calls that the instantaneous capacity of an attraction. That's not really important, except it's perhaps the number of people who are taken off the theme park walkways for a while. So forget about how many people are on the ride at any given time. It doesn't matter. And it also doesn't matter how many people are getting off the ride. It's only the number of people getting on the ride that determines how fast the line moves. So that's what we use to find THRC. Just think about THRC as a flow rate. It's the speed at which the line moves forward. Another way to think about THRC is just the number of people getting on the ride every hour. If you remember, we are trying to make sure our park has at least 20,400 entertainment capacity units per hour. The THRC for every attraction in the park contributes to that number. If you add up all the THRC numbers from every attraction and show in the park, they'll add up to at least 20,400. So why does this matter? Beyond just making sure everyone gets 2 rides an hour, the THRC basically drives the design of the entire attraction, and you'll see that later. So now that we know what THRC is, let's talk about the terms we need to know in order to solve for THRC, and there's just 2 of them. The first term we need to understand is riders per dispatch. For example, if you've got a train with 10 cars, each holding 4 passengers, then your riders per dispatch will be 40. It's just 10 times 4. Just count the number of people leaving the station for each dispatch to get this number. Then there's the dispatch interval. The dispatch interval is the time in seconds, minutes, or hours between ride vehicles leaving the station. If it's a show attraction, the dispatch interval is the amount of time between consecutive show starts. So if a ride vehicle leaves the station every 40 seconds, your dispatch interval is, you guessed it, 40 seconds. If a show starts every half an hour, your dispatch interval is 30 minutes. You could also say it's 2 per hour. It's the same thing. You can use seconds, minutes, or hours for dispatch interval, but it changes the equation for each case. And that's why we will have 3 different equations, all variations of the same thing. We can actually use any of the 3 equations to solve for THRC in any case. But if you use the wrong equation, you'll have to start with ridiculously small decimals sometimes. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you pick the right equation, it's faster and easier. So choose wisely. We'll explain how in a second. Dispatches per hour. The first equation we use is when we think about a ride, or especially a show, in terms of dispatches per hour. For example, we would use this equation if you have a show that runs 4 times every hour. We'll generally use this equation when a ride or a show loads a lot of people at once. Minutes per dispatch. The second equation we use is when we think about the ride in terms of minutes per dispatch, as opposed to dispatches per hour. We use this equation for most flat rides and roller coasters and some of the larger dark rides. Seconds per dispatch. The third equation we use is when we think about a ride in terms of seconds per dispatch. You'll use this equation anytime you have tightly packed ride vehicles, all leaving the station nearly continuously. A great example of this would be any of the Omnimover attractions like Spaceship Earth at Epcot, or any ride that loads from a continuously moving belt or turntable. Really, any time a vehicle leaves the station more often than once per minute. You'll notice that these 3 equations are almost the same. The big difference is that in the first case, time is at the bottom of the equation, and in the second and third case, time is at the top. Let's get into it and solve some of the equations so that you understand how to do it. Let's start with case number 1, dispatches per hour. As we mentioned, when we talk about dispatches per hour, it's usually referring to a ride that takes a lot of people at once, or a large show. This one is the most simple case. To solve this equation, it's just the dispatch interval expressed in the number of dispatches per hour times the number of riders per dispatch. Just multiply the two numbers together, and that's it. For example, the Hall of Presidents at the Magic Kingdom in Florida has a capacity of 700 people per show. It's a 23-minute show with a load time of 7 minutes, so the show runs every half an hour. In other words, the dispatch interval is 2 shows per hour. At 2 dispatches or shows per hour, we can solve it like this. Take 700 people per dispatch times 2 dispatches per hour equals 1400 THRC. And that's all there is to it. A lot of shows will fall under this category because they'll generally only run between 1 and 4 shows per hour. A boat ride like Magic Kingdom's Liberty Bell is another example of a ride where you would use this equation. The big picture is that anytime you have a very long story to tell with large audiences, you'll use this equation. I might mention that you will also use this equation for small audiences in some cases, like escape rooms. They have small audiences, but because escape rooms are generally pretty long, about an hour, you would use this equation to calculate THRC. The second case is when the ride vehicle dispatches every few minutes. Most roller coasters and flat rides fall into this category because these rides typically dispatch about once every 1 to 4 minutes. Notice in the first case, with dispatches per hour, time is at the bottom. But in the second case, minutes per dispatch, time is at the top. And because of that, we have to solve it just a bit differently. So to solve this equation and find THRC, we take the riders per dispatch divided by dispatch interval in minutes and then multiply times 60 minutes per hour. That gives you THRC. Now, we're going to show you a quick way to solve these equations and check your work at the same time. This is how engineering students solve equations. But don't worry, you don't have to be an engineering student. You can do this. Just draw a horizontal line across the page. Then draw vertical lines separating the terms. So if you have 3 terms to multiply and divide, you'll have 2 vertical lines separating each term. Anytime you have a term you need to multiply, place the number on the top of the line, and anytime you have a term to divide, place it on the bottom. You also place the units next to each number. The trick here is that anytime you see a per, that means you're dividing, so you place that unit on the bottom. For example, if you have a roller coaster that carries 32 riders per dispatch, put 32 riders on the top. Directly below it, put dispatch because it's 32 riders per dispatch. So we have 32 riders per dispatch there. Then in the second box, we will put our dispatch interval of 2 minutes per dispatch. But because we're dividing by 2, put the 2 minutes on the bottom. The per dispatch part is a little tricky. What do you do when something is already on the bottom? Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. When you're dividing by something that's already being divided, it just goes back to the top. Therefore, put dispatch on the top right above 2 minutes. And you can see when we get done, we're dividing by 2 minutes per dispatch. In the third box, you're multiplying by 60 minutes per hour. So 60 and minutes goes in the third box. And because it's per hour, hours go directly below that, on the bottom. Then to solve the equation, you just multiply each term straight across the top and divide by each term on the bottom. It's 32 people per dispatch, divided by 2 minutes per dispatch, times 60 minutes per hour, equals 960 riders or people per hour. You can check your work by canceling out any units that are on the top and the bottom. Dispatches cancel out because they're both on the top and the bottom, and minutes also cancel each other out. This leaves you with riders per hour, which is just THRC. It seems complicated until you realize that there are only 3 things to multiply and divide. The big picture is that you would use this equation when you have a slow ride with a little more story to tell, or if the story dictates separate ride vehicles that can't see each other or be near each other, like my old ride, the Jungle Cruise, or a train ride, or pretty much every roller coaster. The third equation is basically like the second one. Instead of minutes per dispatch, it's seconds per dispatch. Because of this, you multiply 3600 instead of 60 to convert to riders per hour. This is because there are 3600 seconds per hour. So when you're finding THRC for an attraction that goes by seconds per dispatch, the equation looks like this. Riders per dispatch divided by the dispatch interval in seconds per dispatch times 3600 seconds per hour. For example, Radiator Springs Racers at California Adventure has a dispatch interval of 12 seconds with 6 riders per vehicle. To determine THRC, this would be 6 riders per dispatch divided by 12 seconds per dispatch times 3600 seconds per hour equals 1800 THRC. To solve this and check our work, if we draw our horizontal line with our vertical line separating terms, in the first box, put 6 riders with dispatches directly below it. Then put 12 seconds per dispatch in the second box. But remember, we are dividing by 12 seconds per dispatch, so 12 seconds goes on the bottom. And again, the per dispatch part goes back up on the top anytime you're dividing by something that's already on the bottom. So the second box has 12 seconds per dispatch in there, 12 seconds on the bottom and dispatch on the top. It's flipped because you're dividing. And then the last term has 3600 seconds per hour. Put 3600 seconds on the top with hours directly below it. To check our work, cancel out anything that is both on the top and the bottom. Seconds cancel out, and so do dispatches, leaving us with riders per hour, which is THRC. And again, just multiply every number above the line and then divide by any number below the line. 6 riders per dispatch divided by 12 seconds per dispatch times 3600 seconds per hour equals 1800 THRC. As an aside, Imagineers did something very interesting with the dispatch interval for Radiator Springs Racers. At the beginning of the ride, which is the dark ride portion, the dispatch interval is 12 seconds. But halfway through the ride, they double up the cars and launch them together for the race. This doubles the dispatch interval to 24 seconds, but it also doubles the riders per dispatch, so the THRC stays the same for both halves of the ride. You can bet the Imagineers understand how to solve for THRC. The big picture for using seconds per dispatch is that you will use this equation when you have a very short story to tell, a story with a lot of show scenes your audience will only see for a few seconds, and especially if a scene must be reset between ride vehicles. This is an important thing to keep in mind. Remember that the faster your show scene, the fewer people you're going to be able to get into your ride vehicle and dispatch, with the required faster-paced dispatch interval. Because of this, ride vehicles are generally small, usually less than 12, when you're using a ride system that goes by seconds per dispatch. It's really about choosing the appropriate ride system for the story you want to tell. More on that later. Now you might be thinking, how can I load 12 people in 12 seconds and get seatbelts on and then dispatch them? There are a couple options. In one case, like with Radiator Springs Racers, you can simply load 4 ride vehicles at the same time and then dispatch them on a 12-second interval. The other option is to use an omni-mover system to take small groups of 2 to 3 riders every few seconds. And that's it. Now you know how to quickly and easily calculate THRC, and it really helps knowing how to do this. If you start with the experience and then decide how you want to tell the story, you can select an appropriate ride system with an appropriate dispatch interval, and then your attraction will meet its capacity requirements. Now you may be asking yourself, after all that, how do I design the attraction and select the right ride system? Well, I'm glad you asked, because that's the next thing we're going to talk about.